Oh, he's here.
He's
Hi,
here.
Nick. Okay, let's start, Mohammed.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, thank you. I would like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Fahd Al-Turki. Thank you, Abdul Mohsen Al-Khalaf. Thank you, task force co-chairs, authors, and members. Also, I would like to thank our lead co-chair, Dr. Rajal Marzouki, who couldn't join us today due to some commitments. Infrastructure is one of the most critical elements for any country's functionality, economy, and prosperity. In fact, developing sustainable, reliable, and resilient infrastructure has been a challenge for many policymakers around the world, especially in developing countries. While fighting against COVID-19 pandemic these days, most, if not all, countries are indeed questioning their infrastructure's ability to handle such circumstances. Today, we have experts in the field of infrastructure investment and financing to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on infrastructure development. I'll stop here and let's kick off our webinar with Dr. Fahd Al-Turki, co-chair of T20 Saudi Arabia and Vice President of Research at CAPSARC. Please, Dr. Fahd.
Thank you, Mohammed, and it's a pleasure to connect with everybody here. And on behalf of the T20, we apologize for the technical issues that we faced earlier today. Thank you for attending our webinar. And we had a series of webinars since the start of the week and within the next few weeks in the run-up to our June event, which is going to be in June 15, 16, and 17. So I would like to extend the invitation to all the participants today to also join us then. A special thanks goes to Abdul Mohsen Al-Khalaf, who is Chief Policy Officer for the Finance Track Program. Abdul Mohsen is a dear friend and previous colleagues in the financial sector. So we're pleased to have you with us, Abdul Mohsen, today. Before I say my note, I would like to ask the panelists to turn their mic to mute, so just to minimize the noise. And once we move to the panel, we can unmute the mic to allow us to be heard. I would like to highlight in the beginning of this webinar that the COVID-19 pandemic is above all is a human tragedy. And perhaps it's the most significant civilizational threat that we have seen in our lifetime. By now, COVID-19 has spread to more than 4 million people in over 180 countries, with an infection rate that we have never seen before. In particular, not before a century ago. With such an infection rate, there is a major implications on the way we live, our social life, our healthcare system, our markets, and the economy in general. No country is immune of these impacts. Even strong and well-funded healthcare systems are struggling to keep up with the pace of the spread of the virus. Even with introduction of social distancing measures in many countries. And the socio-economic impact, and importantly for this task force, are very clear. I mean, we're looking at economic growth, global economic growth turning into negative territory. The IMF is looking at -3 for this year, which is the largest since the Great Depression. And while they are forecasting a +3 for next year, I doubt as an economist that this number is likely to be reached. I think they are overly optimistic, especially that we're seeing unemployment rising to double-digit in many advanced countries. And we are not at the peak yet. Probably unemployment has more room to go up. SMEs are going out of business. And we're hearing reports and news about large corporations having difficulties managing their cash flow. And at the social side, inequalities are deepening in many parts of the world. And we are unable to meet the needs of the most vulnerable households, including the elderly and vulnerable citizens in many places. So how countries respond to this crisis and these circumstances? There are policymakers within each country are faced with two choices. And most of the time, these two choices are contradicting choices. On one hand, if they don't act immediately and lock down, they will risk thousands of deaths from COVID-19. And in addition, they will overwhelm their healthcare system. Alternatively, if they shut down the economy, they will risk an economic meltdown or an economic collapse, with a high mortality rate from probably non-COVID-19 reasons, especially in poorer countries. Whatever the decision that they will take, there will be a significant implication for infrastructure development and as well as financial markets, both in the near term and in the long term. So we should learn from previous crises. And this is, I mentioned this in all our webinars, where global unity and solidarity should be on top of our priorities at a time like this. As we highlighted in our three statements, three T20 statements since early March, we need an immediate investment in critical public services and global public goods to first suppress the virus and also minimize the social and economic impact of the pandemic, and to recover better with minimum impact on the market and investments in essential infrastructure projects, especially in less developing countries. It's needless to say that COVID-19 has highlighted the critical importance of infrastructure to our societies and our economies. After the crisis, there will be clearly major long-term impact on the sector driven by many factors, which include behavioral shifts, exit strategy from the lockdown, the base and the pattern of economic recovery, attitude toward risk, as well as increased government fiscal deficits or budget deficit. So we need to further understand these factors in light of the priorities of this task force, which includes finding innovative frameworks to bridge infrastructure investments gap, promoting infrastructure investments that are resilient, sustainable, and can adjust to the pandemic and its consequences, technology innovation for smart cities, addressing the challenges of rapid urbanization in light of the social distancing measures under the current pandemic, governance of infrastructure investments, global standard of sustainable projects, and last but not least, addressing infrastructure bottleneck in developing countries. To address these issues, from our part as a T20, we issued the three T20 statements before and after the extraordinary summit for the G20 leaders at the end of March. In these statements, we called for a coordinated stimulus package to allocate resources to businesses, workers, and households, especially in less developing countries. Some of our recommendations that are related to this task force include restoring global supply chain, reversing a slowdown in global trade, in addition to introducing tax reduction and low interest rate, and allowing easier access to credit, especially for SMEs, and especially in less developing countries. As observed in early data and also based on experience of previous crises, to maintain the sector of investment in infrastructure, governments and monetary authority must continue to stabilize the global market by continuing to inject much needed liquidity to ensure the essential infrastructure continue to operate in the face of catastrophic disruption. It is an event like this that shows the importance of the think tank community and our contribution to the global economy in facing the global challenges such as this COVID-19 pandemic. Within the context of this task force, government will be eager to boost their economic activity after the crisis. And infrastructure investment is an obvious and necessary stimulus area in this effort to stimulate the economy. So some spending will be, after the crisis, will be related to health and social care projects, as well as digital infrastructure to build a greater capacity and resilience. But this is easy said than done, because as governments emerge from the from this pandemic or the crisis or the ramifications of this crisis, there will be a significant increase in budget deficits in many countries. And this would require a need to reassess the cost-benefit analysis and seek to explore new models where private funds are used to support public opportunities or public outputs. This may suggest the need to reassess and research the new models of public-private partnerships or different arrangements of management of contracts for delivery of services, which on top of my head probably will favor investment banks and investment funds that are and operators who are focusing on providing public services effectively and cost efficiently without taking unnecessary high volume of risk. So I encourage you all to actively participate in this webinar along these lines of maintaining sustainable investment in infrastructure and contribute to the T20 process by maintaining our original mandate, which is providing unbiased, research-based policy recommendations to the leaders of the world. And given the magnitude of this crisis, I would suggest that we go beyond even just providing policy recommendations, but also making suggestions of initiatives for the leaders of the G20 to ensure sustainable investments into essential infrastructure. To conclude, I would like to say once again that the T20 and its partners are devoting their times and effort to help the world in facing the pandemic. And it is events like this that bring us together and encourage us to share our expertise. I look forward to working with all of you and with our partners across G20 and non-G20 countries to expedite this transition to recovery. So thank you very much for your time, and back to you, Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fahad. Now, we would like to hear from Abdul Hassan Al-Khalaf, Chief Policy Officer, Finance Track Program, G20 Saudi Arabia. Please, Abdul Hassan.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Dr. Fahad, for inviting me to present the G20 Infrastructure Working Group priorities for 2020. It is an honor to be with you here today. Let me start with the presentation. If you could, Mohammed, put it up in the screen. Okay. So I see it's on. The content of my presentation is that I will first give a background on the G20 Infrastructure Working Group. Second, I will talk about the Infrastructure Working Group priorities for 2020 under the Saudi G20 presidency. And then I will conclude with the G20 Action Plan in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was endorsed by the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors on the 15th of April 2020. And I will focus within this action plan on the infrastructure response to COVID-19. So let me start with the background on Infrastructure Working Group. As you know, infrastructure is a major driver of growth. It supports the G20 objective of strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. And it is important contributor to the basic facilities that has a tremendous impact on improving the quality of life, businesses, and well-being. The G20 leaders have committed or agreed to promote infrastructure investment, particularly to mobilize private sector resources towards investment in infrastructure and closing the infrastructure gap. Next is, as you can, in addition to the investment, the impact that infrastructure plays on the economy, it is also important to highlight that the global infrastructure spending has gradually increased from 1.8 trillion in 2007 to 2.3 trillion in 2015, representing an average annual growth of 2.9% per year. Over the last decade, infrastructure investments account for around 3% of world GDP and around 12% of total global investment. In a later slide, I will discuss the G20 Action Plan to regain economic recovery. There will be some of the drivers for including infrastructure investment as parts of the stimulus packages. Next is a background on infrastructure working group per year. As you know, the infrastructure working group started in 2014 under the Australian G20 presidency. The G20 has made so far significant efforts to promote investment. In 2014, Australian presidency endorsed the Global Infrastructure Initiative, a multi-year program to boost public and private infrastructure investment, and welcomed the launch of the global infrastructure facilities. Leaders have also agreed and under the Australian presidency to establish the Global Infrastructure Hub, which has been of a great support to the G20 work since then. In 2015, the Turkish presidency developed ambitious country-specific investment strategies, which bring together policies and actions to improve quality infrastructure and develop guidelines and best practices for public-private partnership models. During the Chinese presidency in 2016, the leaders' communique welcomed the joint declaration of aspirations on action to support infrastructure investment by 11 multilateral development banks and endorse the Global Infrastructure Connectivity Alliance launched in 2016. In 2017, the German presidency endorsed, or under the German presidency, the G20 endorsed the MDB joint principles and ambitions on crowding in private finance. I welcome their work in boosting investment in infrastructure and connectivity in infrastructure. The G20 also launched the G20 Africa Partnership, which highlights the need for joint measures to enhance sustainable infrastructure. In 2018, under the Argentinian presidency, the roadmap to infrastructure as an asset class was developed and endorsed by the G20, which aims to promote private sector investment in infrastructure. Implementing this roadmap, the Japanese presidency in 2019 focused on one element of the roadmap, which is the quality infrastructure investment, and came up with the principle on those quality infrastructure investment. Next, or in the second part of my presentation, I'll walk you through the infrastructure working group priorities for 2020 under the Saudi G20 presidency. So infrastructure remains can you go back, Muhammad? Yes, thank you. So infrastructure remains a G20 priority due to the significant financing gap and urgent challenges in the sector. Indeed, narrowing the infrastructure financing gap through projects, improving project efficiency and promoting private sector participation will remain a priority for the infrastructure working group in 2020 under the Saudi presidency. As you know, the Global Infrastructure Hub estimates that by 2040, 94 trillion US dollar will be needed to in infrastructure investment, while only 79 trillion US dollar will be invested based on the current trends, leaving an infrastructure gap of 15 trillion US dollar. So the Saudi G20 presidency tends to build on the work of previous presidency by continuing to address measures that will increase private investment to bridge the gap in financing, and by advancing the implementation of the roadmap to infrastructure as an asset class. So these are mainly the two priorities in this year. I will give more details in the next slide. So the first priority is utilizing the benefit of technology for infrastructure, and we are aiming to come up with an infratech agenda or infrastructure technology agenda that set a roadmap for G20 countries, MDBs, and other related stakeholders to utilize the benefit of technology for infrastructure. And the reason behind choosing technology for infrastructure is that, as you know, in the infrastructure financing gap, there is a demand and supply, and the G20 usually focuses on the supply side of funding, which is important. And this focus also mainly comes through encouraging more private sector participation in the sector. but the demand side of the equation usually forgotten or skipped. So with technology, we can lower the demand for funding in infrastructure, because technology can lower the cost of infrastructure project in all phases of infrastructure, planning, building, maintenance, and so on. So there is an estimate by some MDBs that shows if infrastructure is applied to an if technology is applied in infrastructure project, it could reduce the cost of that project by approximately 10%. So that will also contribute to narrowing the gap of infrastructure investment, but by focusing on the demand side rather than the supply. The second priority is the regulatory framework for private sector participation. And here we are trying to come up with enhanced policy dialogue between the institutional investors and asset managers from one side, and then the public sector from the other side. So these are two priorities that we are working on currently, and the work has been developed and will come together approximately by October this year. So next slide, Mohammed, please. So in the Infratech agenda, the Infratech agenda will provide high-level policy guidance for national authorities and the international communities, including MDBs and IOs, to advance an adaptation of new and existing technologies and infrastructure. So new technology can enhance efficiency across project life cycle and the delivery of infrastructure services with high quality infrastructure, cost effective and building resilience, promoting technology innovation in infrastructure, as well as review existing infrastructure system. So the infrastructure agenda or the Infratech agenda cover or consist of two sections: background for the infrastructure technology and high-level element for policymakers to consider. This document will probably be submitted to the July meeting of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors. Next slide. On the regulatory framework for private sector participation, the Saudi G20 presidency will build on the G20 efforts on the roadmap to infrastructure as an asset class to ensure that the appropriate and effective regulatory framework for private sector participation are developed. As you know, there are 7 pillars of the roadmap or the G20 roadmap to infrastructure as an asset class. The Argentinian presidency covered 5 pillars. The Japanese presidency covered 1 pillar on quality infrastructure, and there are 1 remaining pillar, which is the regulatory framework for private sector participation. We are aiming this year to cover this pillar within the roadmap. So by the end of the Saudi G20 presidency, the roadmap of the G20 that was endorsed in 2018 will be delivered. So next and final section of my presentation is G20 Action Plan in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was endorsed by the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors on April 15th, 2020. There are some parts of that action plan that focuses on infrastructure investment, and I will walk you through that. There is there is 5 elements of the roadmap, or 5 commitments on the G20 Action Plan. First is the health response, or saving lives. Second, economic and financial response, supporting the vulnerable and maintaining conditions for a strong recovery. Third, returning to strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. And fourth, international support to countries in need. And finally, what lessons did we learn from the COVID-19 for the future? Next, yes. The G20 Infrastructure Working Group contribution to the G20 Action Plan is under pillar 3 of the action plan, returning to strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth once containment measures are lifted. In the specific commitment is that we commit to really double our efforts to promote quality infrastructure investment and accelerate efforts to mobilize private sources of infrastructure financing aimed at raising productivity, lifting growth, and promoting job creation. So we are currently working with the relevant MDBs and IOs to develop a concept note on recovery plan, or the role of infrastructure in the recovery plan post COVID-19. And we will be leveraging the current work that we are doing in collaboration with the institutional investors and asset managers. We will be aiming to advance the work of the Japanese presidency last year, which is promoting quality infrastructure investment. We will be focusing, or have a specific focus on the physical risks and that are related to PPPs as part of this analysis. So next. The second pillar, or the second contribution of the IWG is under pillar 5 of the action plan, lessons for the futures. And it is mentioned that, or the commitment is that we, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, commit to build on the G20 infrastructure efforts to increase the resilience of infrastructures against risks, including from pandemics. So we will be leveraging the infratech agenda that we are preparing, and leverage particularly the policy toolkit, the stock take, and we are currently working with the MDBs and IOs to develop these documents. We will be also working on a document that, or a research that is called COVID-19 and New Resilient Infrastructure Landscape. This can inform the recovery or response to COVID-19. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and many thanks again for inviting me to this webinar. It is a pleasure to be with you, and thank you.
Thank you, Abdul Mohsen, for sharing this presentation with us. Today we're delighted to host Nila Henriety from ASEAN Development Bank Institute to talk about quality infrastructure investment in the face of COVID-19 crisis. Please, Nila.
Thank you, Muhammad. Good evening and good afternoon, everyone, and good early morning for some like Beatrice, Miss Akhtar in Pakistan. So I hope you are all healthy and in safe condition. Let's all hope that situation will get better soon. I would like to say thank you to Saudi Arabia Presidency to have this webinar and allow us to share our thoughts about quality infrastructure investment in the face of the COVID-19 crisis. The paper addressed sustainability, profitability, and demand versus resilience of infrastructure project, and I like that G20 now counting on demand on infrastructure financing. Usually we just calculate from the supply side. So the paper is written by Professor Yoshino and I thank him for supporting me to present at this time. So first, I would like to explain the brief idea of our original paper, our first draft. So the paper is built with the background that we all know that infrastructure investment is a crucial driver of economic development, and it's clearly addressed in the G20 quality infrastructure investment. So public sector alone will not be enough to finance infrastructure needs, and McKinsey report that 2016-2030, the world will need $3.3 trillion annually for infrastructure, and ADB estimated that Asia will need $1.7 trillion every year in Asia. So from that a global infrastructure hub count that public funding can only finance 45% of those needs. That's why we need private sector participation in here, and then as Professor Yoshino always mentioned to me, the long-term and patient investor. So for this, that government, G20 government need to find a way how to unlock the potential of the private financing for infrastructure. So in the first draft, we look at the 5 points, like how to quantify positive spillover effect of infrastructure, and then we can share that with private investor at the end. And then how to harness benefit of digital and technology for infrastructure. And we look into option of scenario to recover financial loss after the natural disaster. And furthermore, we also explore the alternative financing to enhance SMEs participation in the infrastructure service, because this is crucial to improve the externality to improve the positive spillover of the infrastructure project. And the last one, that how we can mitigate the bottlenecks in the land acquisition process. So, but you know, in February there's a COVID-19 and then affect our current way of life, and then we decide to modify our policy brief a little bit. So we include the impact of COVID-19 and amplifying that with what we have in the original paper. So in the COVID-19 outbreak, we will bring huge budget deficit and eventually decline in infrastructure investment. So because government provides subsidies to individual and business who are forced to close their business, that is for helping them stay in the business and keep the consumption stable in the economy. However, it leads a sharp increase in the government spending. And then the sudden reversal capital flows also will worsen the situation. Depreciation of the currency will increase the debt service burden in the budget, especially if the debt for infrastructure denominated with foreign currency. So that will squeeze more space in the budget. On the other side, government revenue from tax collection also declined due to the stop of many business activities. So as a result, the government needs to put priorities in their budget spending to immediate action during recovery time. And with this situation, further shortage of financial resources for infrastructure will happen after the COVID-19 outbreak. Government will focus on their economic recovery that will push the infrastructure to be in the lesser priority. So nevertheless, infrastructure should not be set aside, because after the COVID-19 pandemic, the infrastructure will aid economic recovery by helping accelerate economic growth back to normal and even higher through the job creation that infrastructure can make that happen. So next slide. we talk about the policy measures. Yeah. So our first proposal is the government needs to find a way to enhance private sector involvement. Here we suggest that government should ease regulation to ensure that private sector can attain the expected rate of return in the future. Based on the several past economic contraction, private sector financing has recovered much faster than government budget deficit. So preparing more attractive instrument for private financing is an effective solution for sustainable infrastructure. So the attractive instrument can be like in the form of better rate of return. Then with the concept of increase of tax revenue from the positive impact of infrastructure project that can compensate the rate of return. It is timely to implement the spillover effects of tax revenue, considering the low state of the economy this time. So this can help to achieve a new peak in utilizing spillover effect while also helping the economy to recover. So our second proposal is about reattracting overseas capital into infrastructure investment. As the crisis hits developing countries, overseas investors will bring their investment back to their home countries. So infrastructure projects that are receiving financing from abroad will find it difficult to continue financing well. So in order to bring overseas investors into infrastructure investment, the rate of return must be secure, and government need to show political will to ensure that project will still continue regardless economic turbulence. So in this case, risks associated with infrastructure investment must be kept low through public-private partnership concept, PPP concept. And the attractiveness of infrastructure should be enhanced through the increase of rate of return using the spillover effect of tax revenue. So, so next slide is our third proposal related to COVID-19 is the requirement of innovative financing for small and medium enterprise. As we explained, we expect the externality in infrastructure project will be used to compensate rate of return to investors. So therefore, the government needs to create an enabling environment for business, especially SME and startup, to provide service around the infrastructure project. But because of the crisis, and then their lending categorized as risky, so this may be bank reluctant to provide financing for them. So in here, we propose, we have two recommendations, credit guarantee and crowdfunding. So for the credit guarantees, government can increase the ratio of credit guarantee in this difficult time to support smooth lending from bank to SMEs because of the high risk condition right now, difficult situation right now. And then for the second one, the crowdfunding. The crowdfunding is the, we call it Hometown Investment Trust Fund. This is the type of credit support by community. So COVID-19 will increase business failure, especially for startup and SMEs, like I mentioned before, that bank reluctant to lend money to them. So the community can set up the hometown crowdfunding for the alternative sources of financing. And there's two major that they can do that: collect money from individual and lend it to SMEs, and creating platforms for sales expansion. Next slide. I think, yes, and then I have, yeah, I think next slide, please, Muhammad. Could you move to next slide? I don't know, in my computer still the previous slide. So this should be the one with the picture. From this slide, I will explain about the main concept in our policy brief. I mean, before this concept, how to keep financing infrastructure project through this difficult time. And then this slides, the spillover effect of infrastructure. Muhammad, I think this one still, hello. Can you, okay.
Yeah, Nila, this one?
Yeah, I think we need to move to the next slide. So I just keep going. So there's supposed to be a picture and show the graph. So that's the concept, the main concept of our policy brief, that how to improve and quantify the externalities of the infrastructure project. So, and then we measure it in the form of tax revenue. So we take a sample from the highway infrastructure. Along with the development, new business will be opened, new job will be created. That means increased employment, property value will be increased. And eventually, the government will receive more tax revenue from income tax, property tax, sales tax, and etc. So we calculate how much exactly surrounding area of infrastructure affected so, and then we need to compare the affected area and non-affected area around the region where the infrastructure taken place. Professor Yoshino used the difference method in calculating these externalities. So the incremental tax is equal to the difference of tax revenue before and after the construction, should be calculated and distributed to investor in addition to the user charge to compensate the investor. So in developing this kind of infrastructures, government, policymaker, builders, and contractors should think beyond physical infrastructure. They should have integrated design how to maximize the externalities. So there's some important point that I have noted here, that city planning aspect that include the design for areas or zone for market, shop, residencies, and manufacturing industries. Connectivity, as mentioned at G20 Saudi Arabia before, the connectivity of infrastructure to be the source of growth. So if I can explain more, that from the research, Din Yoshino have that in Kyushu Rapid Railway, that the tax revenue increase during the construction of the project, but that's a bit lower when the construction finished and the railway is operated. But when the railway is connected to the other city, busy city, and then the tax revenue increase significantly, even higher than during the construction time. So the connectivity is important here. And the last one, that access to finance and education, because that's make the build the entrepreneurship, the financial wise of the community around the infrastructure area. So, and if you can move to the next slide. I don't know, in my computer, the PPT can like freezing. The PPT still respond to COVID-19 for QI, but I hope that's moving in you. So the next slide in here, that if we combine PPP and spillover effects of tax revenue for infrastructure development, government can keep the risk low and then can offer the better return to the investor. So, and the red line in the picture, that's showing that infrastructure project have the PPP and then a share of the incremental tax revenue, and the blue line showing the if the project only covered by PPP only. So in the next in the next two slides, I will explain about how to implement spillover effect of the concept of spillover effect of tax revenue to other factor that related to infrastructure, but we using that in the other way, on the other way. So we use that to estimate natural disaster. We can create insurance to help region recover quickly after the disaster hit, and how this concept can be so one reviewer gave us comment that this concept can be applied to COVID-19. However, the crisis, the COVID-19 still going on. We don't have a sample, estimate for that yet. So, so then now I just explain from the natural disaster perspective. So using the difference method, we calculate the negative impact instead of positive impact in here. So the calculation here, we focus on the damage in the infrastructure, private business, and the employment. So how much growth in the affected area achieved compared to the non-affected area. So here we use the case study of Nagoya flood. It is found that agriculture region, Iwakura city economy dropped by -35% in 3 years. Business and service sector, Nagoya city dropped by 23% in 4 years, and manufacturing region, Toyota city dropped by -13% in 1 year. So this estimation then can be used as a basis for calculation for government to collect financing or premium for disaster management. Let's call that as reserves. So there are 3 financing steps related to this issue: ex-ante accumulation reserve, fiscal spending, and ex-post accumulation of reserves. So for the ex-ante accumulation, that's occurred before the disaster happened. Government can create non-compulsory disaster insurance and mandatory disaster insurance. So mandatory type, everyone must join, and in non-compulsory, that can be optional, depend on the risk of the area. So this government manage that. So, and then government can assign one insurance company to keep and manage the fund, or create a special vehicle for this purpose. So, and then the next step, that fiscal spending occur right after the disaster event, and the money will be used for rescue and recovery. So when the money is not enough, then government should conduct ex-post accumulation of reserve. But if the calculation is close to accurate, I think the government doesn't need more money to rescue and recover. So, and the next, this next slide, I would like to emphasize the governance for infrastructure. I think that's also focused on by G20 this year, and I think several years before. And so here, I would like to add like one recommendation to that. For the highest, as we know, the highest risk for corruption in infrastructure development is the procurement stage. And the complicated and delicate process is land procurement or land acquisition, especially for highway infrastructure. So this issue sometimes cause stop on the construction stage of infrastructure development that led to substantial loss to the investor and unpredicted change in the government plan. That's because land mafia is prevailing in developing countries. So the land mafia, they act as informal middlemen between government or construction company and the landowners. There's no written legal arrangement for them assigned by landowner, but they ask extraordinary high price to the government and report substantially low price to landowner. They receive huge amount of money as middlemen and left landowner felt dissatisfied to government by underestimating the land value that cause like social problem in some countries. By establishing a land trust is a legal and independent institution representing the landowners to the government and construction company. As a legal institution, land trust should fulfill requirement of good corporate governance and promote transparency. With the assistance of fast development of technology, land trust can create a platform that can be accessed by public about the information of land price in that area. So that will reduce the existence of land mafia. The main objective in the land trust that to bridge the relationship between government and landowner in case that government rent the land for public infrastructure. For this function, land trust institution will conduct independent assessment about the value of the land, the rent value, and collect that for landowners. The rent payment can be calculated using the spillover effect of the tax revenue, as we explained before. So therefore, landowner can still keep the benefit of their land and enjoy the spillover effect created by infrastructure built on their land. So that's the other way to use the spillover effect of tax revenue. I think that's the last of my presentation, and thank you very much for the opportunity. And then for this, I will come back to Muhammad. Thank you.
Okay, great. Now let's move to Task Force 3 co-chairs panel discussion with Nicholas Pouch. Please, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. I hope my sound is loud and clear. We have had like very, very useful additional insights from Fahad Al-Turki, from Abdul Mohsen Al-Khalaf, thank you very much for connecting with the infrastructure working group. And thank you also, Nella, for your very detailed approach to concrete solutions connecting infrastructure investments with the current situation of the current economic situation due to the pandemic consequences. So now we are very lucky to have today John Mathis from the John Mathis and sorry, Beatrice Nofal, Naoyuki Yoshino, and Shamshad Shakhtar from the T20 task forces and co-chairs of the T20 task force, with whom we have prepared for this webinar. So you can see I'm addressing here to the participants. You can raise questions during the exchanges that will follow. There has been a few comments. Thank you very much, Peter Head, for sharing those comments. There is also a question, maybe Mohammed or Abdul Mohsen, you can elaborate on that later, whether the materials such as the presentations that have been shared will be available to the participants to the webinar. So we will address those questions. Before maybe we engage into the discussion, I would like to raise 4 questions that might guide our exchange. First is infrastructure investments have been up until very recently drivers for long-term growth, right? But the COVID-19 is affecting, it has been seen, all investment plans, and it is changing also the risk assessments. There is a very big issue for emerging countries in particular. So that's one big question I think we need to address. Second, we mentioned several times the question of the issue of the quality infrastructure investment principles. And one question is how to review or complete those quality infrastructure investment principles, which were just issued last October or last fall, let's say, at the end of G20 Japan, in the light of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Third series of questions is a little bit different. It's about cooperation between different ranges of stakeholders, which sometimes are in competition, public, private, not-for-profit, etc. How can we upgrade the quality of the cooperation and not just competition for resources? And 4, also a little bit different, but you can see that we are having a complete overview, is this question of connectivity between physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. Can we elaborate on that, not just through principles, but in concrete ways that make sense, not in general, but very precisely on the way to, I would say, addressing this infrastructure and COVID issue among the T20, with the infrastructure working group that is in the wider G20. That's 4 kind of, I would say, big questions. My only remark, and then I will also leave the floor to the co-chairs of the task force. My only remark, both to Fahad Al-Turki and to also Abdul Mohsen Al-Khalaf, while I agree very much with 99% of what was mentioned, there is one missing percent. And this 1% missing for me is everything connected to how infrastructure and recovery in this rescue time and then early recovery can also include sustainability and environmental perspectives. I am not mentioning that just, to raise the green flag, but I am mentioning that because regarding green infrastructure, regarding ecosystem services of infrastructure, regarding natural-based solutions about infrastructure, there are two issues. The first one, clearly, they have a social and an economic value. And I think we would very much need not to assess that, but to understand, especially in the infrastructure working group, everything linked with green infrastructure systems that can contribute to the recovery, right? So it's not about saying it is in the future, something about now. The second issue is that if these questions of natural-based solutions and ecosystem services and environmental impacts are not assessed clearly now in the recovery, and if everything is about classical physical infrastructure and brown infrastructure, then the recovery from today will further damage midterm to long-term environmental issues, be it about climate, CO2 emissions, biodiversity losses. So it's a big question, but we are fortunate in the T20 to be able to address that without bias, but also with a clear understanding, with kind of humility, right? Because we need to provide not just overall reflections, but concrete recommendations. So that's it for this these few words of introduction, and maybe Dean Yoshino or John Mathis, you would like to start our roundtable of exchanges, unless Abdul Mohsen Al-Khalaf wants to add anything.
Okay, thank you very much. So can I start?
Yes, sure.
Thank you, Nicolas. Summarizing very important points. There are 5 points you have talked about. So I hope I can answer most of them, but there are many discussions. First one is long-term growth and infrastructures are closely connected with COVID-19. After COVID-19, many economies had been suffered. Small businesses and so on. And the infrastructure, continuation of infrastructure investment will recover the economy much more quickly. So I think the role of infrastructure is still important. However, public financing is very difficult in near future because of budget deficits. Then we have to bring private sector finance, especially pension funds, insurance, and long-term patient investors who come into infrastructure. So even if short-term crisis may come, long-term investors has to stay in infrastructure investment. That will be helping the long-term and continuous growth. So that is one. And second one is how to review the quality of infrastructure. My definition, our definition in Tokyo, quality of infrastructure is physical quality and also the economic quality and how it will mitigate income disparities and so on. So how much spillover effects could be created will be one of the criteria. Then evaluation can come 2 ways. One is looking at the growth rate of the economy along those infrastructure investment, including IT infrastructure. And second one is how much tax revenues had been gained by infrastructure investment. So the performance review could be 2 ways. And actually Asian Development Bank in Manila will be using our proposal to evaluate infrastructure performance, looking at tax changes of the region or GDP growth in the region. Then thirdly, PPP traditionally was risk avoidance. So whether the public sector will take risk or private sector take risk. And private sector didn't want to take risk. And those are the risk avoidance was PPP in the past. But the good thing is they have to coordinate together in order to mitigate risk and also increase the rate of return. If infrastructure, high quality infrastructure can develop the region, and then the return for those developed increase of tax revenues and others partly come back to private investors, then both public sector and private sector will gain by high quality infrastructure. So in other words, public sector and private sector will be looking for the same direction rather than avoiding risk and those two sectors. And next one is about the soft infrastructure and physical infrastructure. It turns out in our research, education together with infrastructure will develop the region much more. Especially the secondary school and the elementary school education and university education has a positive impact into the region. So infrastructure alone cannot develop the high quality of the individuals. So skilled labor and also basic labor will be needed. And also the good infrastructure can bring SMEs. So those are the points I would like to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. When I listen to you and also to Nela's presentation, I think especially when it comes to the wider perspective, such as connectivity between physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, etc., which are so important, we would need in the task force to be specific about how we can address that in the next couple of weeks or months. And in a longer period of time. This question of the time frame for the solution is very important. I know Abdul Mohsen Al Khalaf wanted to maybe respond to my 1% comment about the green issues, green infrastructure issues, and then we can also continue our discussion.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for these comments and for giving me the floor again. I totally agree with the points that you raised. I think they are important elements of infrastructure that was endorsed under the Japanese presidency last year, which is the Quality Infrastructure Investment Principles. So we are under, or the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors endorsed the action plan on the 15th of April. And the third pillar of the action plan focuses on returning to strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Within that pillar, there is a commitment to promote the quality infrastructure or investment. And here we are looking at all aspects of quality infrastructure, whether it is environmental, social, or economic. And we will be developing a concept note on a recovery plan, working with institutional investors and asset managers with the aim of promoting the infrastructure, quality infrastructure investment. Let me also highlight that the Global Infrastructure Hub, as well as the IFC, which is the private arm of the World Bank, are examining options for planning, prioritization, and development of quality infrastructure investment and analysis of physical measures, as well as ways to mobilize private sector investments in the context of limited physical space. As mentioned by Neela, with innovative funding and financing approaches to deliver resilient, sustainable, and economically efficient infrastructure. These options are being worked on now to promote quality infrastructure it will be submitted for the G20 to consider ways to promote the quality infrastructure investment. But this is in a nutshell how the quality infrastructure investment will be promoted, and how we are looking at the environmental aspects within the recovery plan of the from COVID-19. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Abdul Hussein. And I think you're right. Using the vehicle of a review of the quality infrastructure investment principle in the context of the COVID can both help in terms of, I would say, microeconomic approaches as were developed by Nella, and also macroeconomic approaches, including a stronger part about ecosystem services. I know also, and I want to mention that among the many participants to the webinar today, we have authors and contributors to a number of policy briefs of our task force on upstream planning. I'm thinking about Peterhead, multilateral cooperation. I'm thinking about Anita Prakash, about logistics and supply chains, and I'm forgetting a number. So thank you very much for joining. We want to make sure that our discussion is not just among us, but also is useful for the next steps of development, the thesis of the policy briefs, and also the recommendations according to the situation. John Mathis, you are editor in the Journal of Private Equity, and you have been sharing a number of very interesting possibilities and solutions to strengthen private investment in the context of the COVID crisis. Would you like to share with us your insights about that? And then maybe we will ask Shamshad Atkar and Beatrice Nofal about their vision regarding emerging countries and regarding key environmental issues. Is John among us? John?
Push this a little. How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Nicholas. Just let me take a few minutes to give an observation. I think COVID presents an opportunity. The world is impacted by it in various stages. It's an opportunity actually to unify forces to prevent it from happening again. And if we can use that as an example to pull in private sector financing, that would be good. The view of the private sector from the perspective of this is, what have governments been doing to prevent this from happening in the first place? So the private sector is looking at the public sector for overseeing and preventing this kind of crisis from happening, as opposed to thinking that they can participate in it. But we are learning that there are certain private sector entities that have a greater interest in participating than others. We know that, for example, Bill Gates said in 2014, watch out for catastrophes like COVID. No one responded. No one picked up on that and did something about it. So I think now the timing is perfect for us to reach out, number one, to governments, which we're doing in G20, but also pull the private sector in to get their perspective and engagement in this. And the engagement is not only the technology from the standpoint of building the private sector venture, but also from health service providers, from the medical industry, to pull that aspect of the private sector in. There's an awful lot of multinationals that are dependent on their profits generated from these companies. COVID presents us an opportunity. I think we should move on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. This is very useful. Beatrice or Shamshad, who would like to speak first regarding both the emerging countries aspect, the private sector investment issues, and the environmental issue?
You tell me.
Please go on.
Okay, I'm not going to address that specific question, but I do have some broader comments on the G20 initiative. First of all, having been affiliated with the G20 for almost 5 years, it's impressive how G20 has evolved its infrastructure initiative and how focused Saudis have been in trying to take forward the agenda. So that's the good news. But I think if one were to keep in perspective what John said, we are faced with an unprecedented crisis. It's a health crisis which is transmitting and spilling over to economic crisis and financial crisis. So one, health is itself a very severe contagion, but it carries the risks of taking this forward to every segment of the economy. So looking at infrastructure in isolation is not a great idea in my view, but in how we present infrastructure, we have to take an integrated view and really keep in mind what were the failures. The first failure is that every country, but most of all the developing and low-income countries, have not been able to effectively invest in the social infrastructure. So talk about sustainable infrastructure. One, it is not sustainable. Second, it has not been inclusive. And most of the countries have underinvested in health. Very few laboratories, very few hospital beds. Talk of Asia, which has the largest population and most intense population density, is not capable of servicing the public in terms of even testing or rescuing them from the wrath of the COVID. So I think there has to be a very fresh look from this health crisis of COVID to seeing a more balanced sectoral investment in infrastructure. What would it take to attract private investment in a bigger volume and in an efficient manner to invest in social sectors, both health and education? So that's my first point. Second is, you talked about the long-term impact of infrastructure. I think infrastructure, if effectively steered, is the most important solution to restart the global and national economies, because we all know that the contraction is so severe that we have negative growth, not only this year of a very steep kind downward, but it is going to probably persist going forward, given the issues that will spill over to the next year. It is an indispensable part of economic stimulus. Hence, everything that we talk in G20 should be about reviving infrastructure. And also, it will help us mitigate the risk and effects of the economic paralysis that we are facing. We have not only a productivity crisis, a competitiveness crisis, but we will have swelling of unemployment and we have poverty rates growing. So what will help us now is my next point. It's the global cooperation and governance mechanism. Unfortunately, we have inherited a situation since 2008 where global governance mechanism has deteriorated or is at a standstill. Now, Saudis have a unique opportunity to really ignite fire under it and make sure that global governance mechanism results in cooperative mechanism. And my last point on this is that it is important that as we are looking at it, we have to talk about how we manage infrastructure risk. We are not going to, if we are going to focus on private investment, we will have to review the risk mechanisms, both the trying to give comfort to private sector from the policy side on how to manage, how we will manage the risk from a public sector standpoint, but also how to, moving forward, mitigate the much more severe risk. And in that context, the global governance mechanism can help us in two ways. Give real money for infrastructure, and second, credit enhancement mechanisms will help us out. Thank you, Nicholas. I know you were waiting, but I think you took more time than what I have taken. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I think these questions about governance and about choices regarding infrastructure investments are very important, and I hope we can include that as part of the key recommendations for the whole task force. We have a little bit less than 30 minutes before us, and I would like also that we can have some exchange between us as panelists and also the participants. But Beatrice Nofal from ECO-Axis and former also Sherpa of G20 Argentina. I know, Beatrice, you want to make a strong point regarding the environmental dimension of both the recovery and the governance. Beatrice?
Yes. Thank you very much. Well, first, I want to try to make it short, but a few comments about the present situation in the global economy. And let me say before that a thank you note to everybody, to those who have presented, but also to the participants. So we are in the midst of a global sudden stop in order to contain the COVID crisis. Why? Because we don't have a vaccine and we don't have a treatment yet. And this is unprecedented. It started as a supply shock, it's going into a demand shock with the risk of spiralizing. And we are, like Keynes said, in a situation of radical uncertainty about its evolution. Its evolution is conditioned first by the epidemiology and the evolution of the virus, and its containment second by the responses of national governments that are supporting vulnerable populations, firms, etc. in this sudden stop. But not all of that is sufficient, particularly in the case of developing countries. Nicholas had pointed out the responses are not sufficient, and also they are suffering at the moment where they're suffering a lowering in their national income because of massive capital flights that Dr. Yoshino and Nella pointed out. Sorry, I'm running out of battery. I didn't realize it was, just hold a minute.
Okay, do you want a couple of minutes, Beatrice? We can.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I didn't realize I was unlocked. That's okay. So not all the responses are sufficient, particularly in the case of the developing countries that, like I say, first they're facing a drop in commodity prices, massive capital flights, drop in remittances, so large financing gaps at the moment, and they have limited fiscal and monetary space. So if this situation paralyzes, there is a risk of another financial crisis in developing countries. So what we need to be aware that there is no solution out of the COVID-19 unless all countries get out of this risk. And for developing countries, we need not for developing countries, for the world, we need a global coordinated policy response. And this is the time of G20. This is a big challenge for G20. It's an epic challenge, and it's a governance challenge. We need leadership. And it's very important. So I think here, and I get now to the crisis is, like John says, is always an opportunity. It's accelerating digitalization and scientific research. But also the crisis has shown us that there are two global public goods that the global governance system has to provide. One is public health, and the second one, which is related to global public health, is an environmental healthy planet. Now I get to infrastructure. I think one of the responses of G20 has to be related to quality infrastructure and make quality and sustainable infrastructure a key pillar of the global economic recovery. And for that, a number of things have to be done. Mulsen showed us the emphasis is being put on technology, on harnessing technology and developing appropriate regulatory frameworks to attract private sector investment. That's part of the solution, but it's not all of the solution. We really need, and here John Mattis' proposals, we need the G20 to come with a global Infrastructure Fund. Shamstad just said we need to enhance financing for developing countries that provides credit enhancement, provides loans. We need, there are a number of mechanisms there proposed by John Mattis. I don't want to go into the detail, but I think that's one of the pillars, and it will be for the world. If we could agree on a global sustainable infrastructure fund, it will be great. I think the second is what has been said, and Nela and Dr. Yoshino had the recommendation is strengthen the attractiveness for private sector investment. They emphasize the return side. In order to have private sector investment, you need to have profitable opportunities, you need to have certain appropriability of returns, and you need to have how to finance it. So the financing has to be taken care of. They emphasize the return. Regulation has to do with the appropriability of the return, but also with lowering risk and environmental risk. It's a key question. That's why it's so important to incorporate some of the recommendations coming from the participants, like the importance to incorporate nature-based solution and ecosystem services into the definition of quality infrastructure principles, the importance of helping developing countries build integrated planning capacities, particularly upstream planning, in order to consider the benefits of natural capital, to improve urban-rural links, to assure, to improve also resilience and assure, I don't know, the protection of water, land, etc. Also, in terms of deforestation, well, there are a number of, I don't want to go in detail on all that, but it's in our policy briefs. But regarding deforestation, I think there is a moment that the world has to come out with an initiative in order to provide international funding streams to support deforestation-free development models, and also to promote reforestation and biodiversity generation. Finally, the issue of resilience. It's a key issue that has been also raised by several participants. So I think, and the issue of harnessing technology in order to lower costs, like Dr. Admulsen showed, but also to improve ecosystem management. I think it's key, particularly at the time of big data and artificial intelligence, where you can do a lot of improvement in terms of ecosystem management by incorporating technology. So I think there are 5 messages. The policy briefs are very good and provide substantial recommendations. They were written before the explosion of the COVID-19 crisis. So I think in the second draft, we should provide an opportunity for the authors to maybe tailor some of the recommendations regarding the exit of this crisis and preventing a new crisis. And there the environmental aspects and nature-based solutions and the preservation of natural capital are key in order to prevent new crises. And also what is key, I think, is information requirements. In 2017, when I was Sherpa for Argentina, Chancellor Angela Merkel incorporated the health group as one of the working groups in the Sherpa track. And one of the reasons was the crisis of Ebola in Africa. So they wanted to assess the preparedness of countries in order to respond to such a crisis. Well, why don't we have information requirements? In the same way we have information requirements as members of the IMF in terms of macroeconomic performance data, I think we should also have information requirements, and when there is an outbreak of an epidemic in any country, we should be obliged, particularly if we are a G20 member, to the international community about this, because if we would have been informed on time, and here's the responsibility of countries, of international organizations, probably the contagions, what we know as the curve, and would have not been as damaging as it has been. So I think, so with this I finish, but I think information requirements in the health group should be mandatory in an interconnected world in the future.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this message that goes beyond our issues of infrastructure system, but which is nevertheless very important. Two things maybe. First, one proposal to our representative of the infrastructure working group, because you have shared with us, and thank you again, very valuable material regarding the priorities and the upcoming schedule and agenda. We will discuss internally within the task force and with Raja Al-Marzouki, and share that also with the different contributors. But it would be very extremely interesting if there would be space in the recommendation of the infrastructure working group for two aspects that we are touching on in many of the 20 policy briefs which are under consideration in our task force. The first one is about the connectivity between physical infrastructure and social infrastructure at large, which incorporates elements that Nella has mentioned and Dean Yoshino has recaptured. And second point, the issue of environment at large with nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, etc. But again, we want to do that concretely, not just, raising the flag. And we could do that also including logistics and supply chains, including the situation in a number of G20 countries such as India, etc. But I would like to open this possibility here. And if you would like to react, Abdul Mohsen, that's of course possible. And second is also to address this question of COVID-19 related recommendations, of course, in the second draft of the papers that are under consideration in our task force. If the contributors wish to develop specific sets of inputs, analysis, and recommendations linked with the COVID, please do that. The only requirement will be that it cannot be artificial. It needs to be substantiated and evidence-based and related to the main thesis of the policy briefs. That's more of an information of what will come out from the papers. Okay, Abdul Mohsen, would you like to give us a comment maybe, or otherwise we can take some questions, and I will have a last round of comments from the co-chairs of the task force.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, once again. I think many of the panelists raised very substantive issues regarding or that could promote the financing for infrastructure in a sustainable way. Regarding your point on the collaboration between this task force and the IWG working group. I think attending with us this webinar is the policy lead of the G20 infrastructure working group, Rakan Ibn Dhesh, and also the co-lead or the policy co-lead of the G20 infrastructure working group, Khalid Bawazir. Both of them are with us, and we are collectively with Rakan and Khalid. We will be more than happy to cooperate with the task force and think of ways to promote our common objective of closing the gap in a sustainable manner. The topic of connectivity between social and physical is an interesting one, and we could expand that further. Also, on the environmental sustainability, we could give a presentation or later discussion on how we are advancing environmental sustainability within the infrastructure. Thank you once again.
Yes, thank you for this indication. This is very, very important and precious material, not just for the process of the task force, but so much effort has been invested have been invested by over 100 contributors, well over 100 contributors in all G20 countries and even beyond. We have, I think, interesting recommendations to share and also to refine according to I would say, the wider picture of the G20. In the next couple of minutes, I would like to get back to one critical question, which is both technical and substantial. That is, and that's for all of us, how can we shape infrastructure systems in the next months and years to support growth, including two things. First, disaster preparedness, including pandemics, which has never been done really before at the global stage. And second question, concretely, how can we avoid that the recovery, which will be bumpy, but how can we avoid that the recovery is just about building kilometers of roads and pouring concrete into new buildings, because this will have consequences on CO2 emissions that will be impossible to manage. So maybe those two issues, unless you have something else you would like to address. Professor Yoshino or John Mathis, any comment on that?
Let me make just one quick comment. I think it's a question and a comment, and that is, how many representatives from the private sector do we have participating with us in this discussion? And that's, I don't feel you have to answer that. But if you want the private sector to fund this and fund part of it and be more involved, we need to include them. So maybe it means we need a P20 in addition to a G20.
Yes, and if Raja Al-Marzouki would have been with us, I know his answer would have been, because he's considering that there is the B20 as an engagement group, which is from the private sector, and he has started to engage a discussion between our task force and the B20 regarding infrastructure and the role of the private sector. So in the coming weeks, in the coming days, we will be able to tackle this very question, John, within the discussion of the task force. Professor Yoshino. Please unmute.
I was muting my mic. I think infrastructure and environmental issues are closely connected, and especially railway, road, and highway, and so on. Each infrastructure has a different exposure of polluted gases. But I think my opinion is it is important to tax on CO2, NOx, and other polluted gases from the beginning. Then it is automatically implemented into the cost increase of those exposures. So I think it is better to have another with another task forces and then create a better method to talk together. Thank you.
Professor Yoshino, may I ask, when you mention another task force, are you thinking about one in particular?
Oh, I see. Okay. I think some of them are talking about urbanization and urban structure, and those are the task forces. Okay.
Okay. We will build on this useful recommendation. Absolutely. Shamshad, you have raised very important comments on the governance choices and balance of investment choices. As far as growth strategies in the coming months and in the coming 2 or 3 years, how would you think we should prioritize the strategy of the T20 regarding this question of balancing investments?
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Can you hear me this time better?
Yes, yes, it's perfect.
Okay. Okay, I wanted to mention in response to your question, I think G20 has invested a lot in building knowledge management frameworks, educating, toolkits, this, that. But, you know, right now, with so much spending going on, trying to rescue people out of the crisis, investing in SMEs, investing in people, and so forth. Right now, virtually, there is very little new investment coming into infrastructure. In fact, there is a fear that all the infrastructure investment that is at a standstill will be accompanied by the litigation eventually, because big monies are involved in infrastructure, delays are there, so contractors will have to be paid and so forth. That's a totally different story. But now going forward, post COVID, it's important to recognize that where do we get the funding to be able to invest more heavily in infrastructure. And the only way out right now is, as I was mentioning, is to actually think through very effectively how to steer infrastructure funding. And rather than just talk about studies and talk about documents and approaches and all that, what we do need is big money. And we do need G20 to recognize that the global governance mechanism forum that it is, it's got to find help in financing a global infrastructure fund and accompany it with whatever strings one need to accompany it. One string could be to invest in, as everybody said, in green infrastructure, inclusive infrastructure. Now, in order to create space, right now there's no fiscal space available. There's no balance of payment space available when it comes to the developing, emerging, low-income countries. So what do? If you create an infrastructure fund, global, and then attach whatever strings have to be attached to get improved quality of infrastructure, then we will get the same thing that we have all been talking about. Now, what we additionally need is a risk management framework to basically underwrite the risks associated now, given that pandemic brings its own risks. And one last point, which is important, is that we need to really look at the tax framework. I hear all kinds of things. Either you give tax holidays or you give tax incentives to X, Y, Z. Now, if you take away the taxes in interest of stimulating infrastructure, you're going to have a hard time stimulating infrastructure because somebody has to pay for infrastructure. Also, countries are facing debt. Last point, countries are really facing a lot of serious issues with their debt. Debts have gone up as a proportion of GDP. So G20 has rightly talked about debt relief. I think we need concrete proposal and action on that front.
Thank you very much. Your point on debts is very important, and your point about risk is also very important. Your point about litigation, and we are starting to see litigation coming out from contracts and payments, etc., is absolutely not secondary and has a very short-term issue. I think the G20, because we have finance ministers and we have head of states, can really address that very question. Before we wrap up our conversation, we have 5 minutes, and I would like to give then a final word to Abdel Mohsen Al Khalaf. I would like maybe to hear one last comment from Beatrice on what we have heard and this question of risks and future growth systems. And if Nella would like to add anything after her brilliant presentation, please in the next minutes or so do that, and then we will make sure to keep 2 minutes to wrap up the discussion of today with Abdel Mohsen Al Khalaf. Nella or Beatrice?
Well, thank you. Basically, I think there are 5 messages coming from from all the wonderful policy briefs. The first is we need to strengthen the attractiveness of private sector investment by lowering risk and enhancing return. Lowering risk means basically environmental sound projects, and for that you need appropriate upstream planning capacities in developing countries. You need to incorporate nature-based solutions. You need a mix of green and gray. Lowering risk today has to do with quality infrastructure in all of its dimensions, but also incorporating nature-based solutions and ecosystem services in the concept of quality infrastructure principles. The environmental dimension was not so much emphasized last year in the quality infrastructure principles. Third, I think it's very important to strengthen multilateral cooperation and multilateral finance support, even for blended finance, even for incorporating the private sector, particularly in the case of developing countries. Shamshad had mentioned this point, and I think this is a key response we expect from the G20. Harnessing technology and resilience, the importance of resilience are also key recommendations that have to be, come from the policy briefs. So I'm not going to say any more, but if the G20 this year only focuses on the regulatory framework and harnessing technology and says nothing about finance, it will not be up to what the world is expecting from G20 this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Nella, one word, and then we keep 2 minutes for the infrastructure working group.
Yeah, Beatrice actually already mentioned almost all my point, but I would just want to emphasize one that John Mattis mentioned, that this is timely. I mean, whatever the public infrastructure that we need before, and is many countries or many people against the private sector, against like environmental aspect, biodiversity, and then some maybe less priority infrastructure before a carbon tax, like the news mentioned. Now it's kind of like the world, the eyes of the world, the public, the policymakers can like open. Or this is the problem. So maybe this is the time to establish like regulatory framework. You know, like Beatrice said, maybe the rule is cannot help, but actually for the attractiveness of investment, we need to change the framework, the regulation framework, to make that, you know, the tax revenue can be quantified. So that needs to be established now, and then can be implemented after the pandemic. Yeah.
Very clear point. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Abdul Mohsen Al Khalaf, we leave you the floor for the last words of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Nicholas and colleagues, for these comments. Let me touch upon two issues. The first is on the private sector participation or financing for infrastructure. So as I mentioned, one of the priorities that we are working on is the regulatory framework for private sector participation in infrastructure. Let me share with you some statistics on the work that we are doing on in collaboration with the private sector. So we held a couple of events to enhance the policy dialogue between the institutional investors, asset managers, and the public sectors. Those events were attended by almost plus 500 participants and attendees. Those attendees held 16 trillion asset under management. So they had huge portfolios to invest in infrastructure. More than 60 entities from all around the world. Then we established the dialogue between those institutional investor and asset managers and the public policymakers from G20 countries. We followed up with 33 virtual interviews and conferences with those entities to understand their challenges, see what prevent them from investing in infrastructure, what they would like to see in infrastructure investment or infrastructure as an asset class. So we received almost more than 70 notes or feedbacks from different entities on those on the challenges that they are facing. Now will be working with the G20 countries to address those challenges, which hopefully it will take sometimes to be implemented, and then encourage the private sector or increase the financing. This is one point on the private sector. The second point is on the environmental, social, and governance of an infrastructure. As all of us know, for private investors, ESG has become increasingly important, and many of them incorporate it into their decision making. So while we have paid attention to the environmental sustainability of an infrastructure projects, I think the COVID-19 reinforced the importance of the social aspect of an infrastructure. And I think the social focus is equally important, and that could be I think studied further or promoted further within the work of the G20 in 2020 and beyond. And this probably linked to the point that you raised on the connection between social and physical infrastructure. With this, I thank you again for the invitation, and we will remain open for further discussion and cooperation with this amazing task force. Thank you.
Abdul Mohsen, thank you so much. I think we will reconvene with the co-chairs of the task force and the lead co-chair, and share very soon a communication and email with you with a couple of recommendations, proposals, questions, so as to move on a very concrete basis. And again, most appreciated. Thank you so much also for Dr. Fahad Al-Turki to make this connection between our task force and the infrastructure working group happen here. Mohammed Al-Doubian, I leave you the floor to close officially our discussion, and maybe give the participants a little bit of information about how this material will be put online, and some next steps of the task force. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. I know we're among big names in the field, and would love to drink from the fire hose of their knowledge and experience, but we're kind of limited with time. I wish we could had some questions to answer, but the time is over. Thank you so much for your time and effort. Thank you, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki. Thank you, Abdul Mohsen Al-Khalaf. Thank you, Nela, for your presentation. Thank you, Task Force 3 co-chairs, members, and authors. Looking forward to working with you, and please stay safe, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.